Okay, hello to the third day of the fifth International Queer Buddhist Conference. And today we will start with a workshop, which is called Introduction to Buddhist Counselling and Queer Suicide Prevention by Kody Muncaster, PhD. They uses the pronouns they, them. Kody is an, oh my God, OCSW psychotherapist and clinical director of Pink Lotus Counseling and Psychotherapy, specializing in trauma therapy, mindfulness, gender, and sexuality. They have taught several courses at the University of Toronto's Buddhism, Psychology, and Mental Health program, such as Buddhism and Psychotherapy, Socially Engaged Buddhism, and Buddhism and Cognitive Science. They have also taught queer trauma and resilience at Western University. Their PhD dissertation looked at what we can learn from AIDS activism that could help us create a queer suicide prevention approach that is not just individual, but also structural. They have a forthcoming book, a book that is already published with Sumero Press on queerness and transness in Buddhism. They are training to be a Zen priest under Venerable Bhikkhuni Thich Tin Quang. Welcome, much welcome, Kody Muncaster.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see all of you. And thank you for that warm introduction, Jampa. So I'm going to share my screen. And it might take me a minute because sometimes I have trouble figuring out how to share on full screen. So let's see if this works.
What is this?
So are you seeing the full screen, or are you seeing something else? Okay.
So something went wrong, I think. I'm sorry.
That's okay. What came on the screen?
I only see you and me, and I don't know why.
Okay. I'll just share it like this. This should be good. Can everybody see that?
I can see it, but I don't know about the others.
Great. So today I'd like to talk about, first we're going to talk about basic counseling skills, and then in the second half we'll discuss suicide prevention. And I wanted to talk about this because I've presented several years in the past at IQBC, and often I present info about queerness and Buddhism in both historical and contemporary contexts. And this year I wanted to do something practical that imparts skills, especially since we're discussing with the theme of the conference some of the challenges related to abuse. And so I wanted to look at how we can support abuse survivors as well. And so to begin, I wanted to parse out a little bit about what counseling is and what it isn't. So these are definitions used in Ontario, Canada, and they may look differently depending on the jurisdiction, but I find the distinction between the two in Ontario really helpful in thinking through what we're trying to talk about, or what we are talking about today. So in my jurisdiction, counseling involves supportive listening, referral. It's used in case management and crisis counseling. It's often used for everyday issues. And it's not really about developing like a long-term treatment plan for serious psychological issues. So in my jurisdiction, a person educated in counseling can do counseling, and they don't necessarily need a license, but you do need a license to practice psychotherapy. So I bring up this distinction because what I'm teaching today is not psychotherapy, but rather I wanted to teach counseling because this is something that everybody can do, rather than teaching something that only people with licenses like what I have can do. So it's a intro to skills that you can hone over time through practice. And maybe these skills might come in handy the next time that you're with somebody who's having a difficult time, especially if we're talking with queer people who have experienced abuse in Buddhist communities or in other spiritual communities as well. And what we're trying to do here is to help people feel heard. We're not looking to psychoanalyze people. That's a different training, and that takes a long time to learn how to do. And we don't necessarily have to be in a work setting to use these skills. And at the same time, we're not trying to be everyone's counselor. We don't do ongoing formal counseling with people that we have other relationships with. And we know that these skills can be transferable. They can help us become a better listener for those who are close to us who might be having a hard time. So if you're in maybe a pastoral care or a spiritual care setting, it would be valuable to first explain the limits of confidentiality with the person that you're talking about or talking with. So these limits look different depending on your jurisdiction, where you live, and depending on whether or not you have a license to practice a profession. So for example, some jurisdictions might have limits like confidentiality could be broken if the person discloses that they're actively planning to harm themselves or someone else. And this is something that we're going to parse out a bit in the second half of today's workshop. So there's a difference between passive suicidal thoughts and having an active plan. So it doesn't mean that the second somebody brings up suicide that we need to break confidentiality. We're really talking about if there is a imminent threat to life. And some places may have limits on confidentiality regarding if there's abuse of a child or a person with a disability, if there's an abuse of an older adult or a person with a disability residing in an institution or under the care of another person, or if there's sexual abuse by a healthcare provider. So these more specific limitations are often linked to professional licenses, or if you're working for an organization, there may be limitations as well. And you may want to think about what those limitations could look like if you maybe are in a temple that hasn't thought about under what circumstances we may need to take necessary steps to protect life. So at the beginning, we want to let people know what to expect. We can let people know that we're there to listen, to ask questions, and to provide referrals. And it can be beneficial to sit in kind of a square shape. So we're towards the person, but not directly in front in a confrontational type of way. In North America, people tend to prefer to sit between 1 to 1.5 meters away from the other person, and distance might differ between cultures. We know that women are socialized to talk directly in front of each other face to face, and men are brought up to talk side by side while they're doing activities. So you can use this knowledge to your advantage. We haven't had studies done on the body language of non-binary folks yet. And it's important to let the person sit closer to the door so that they feel like they have an exit. And it's really valuable to mirror the person's body language subtly. So we don't do it in a really obvious way, but if the person, maybe they have their arms crossed, maybe you might subtly cross your arms a little bit. And this can help subconsciously create a sense of co-regulation. So a sense that you're here for them, you are hearing them, and that you're picking up what they're putting down. And it's very important to be aware of your own body language. So you can intentionally move your face to express things to them. I know earlier in life, I didn't move my face enough sometimes. And so as part of my training, when I was when I was developing as a psychotherapist, I looked at my own body language in the mirror and worked on moving my face. And we want to maintain equanimity. Equanimity being one of the Brahma Viharas. So we don't want to look shocked. We can look concerned, and we don't need to be stone-faced or act like we're not affected by what's happening, but we don't want to look so shocked that it becomes about them taking care of us. And what's really important, my teacher, Bhikkhuni Thich Ting Quang, taught me this, is that counseling is a meditation in itself. So when you are talking to someone, it's really important that you use your meditation skills the entire time. You want them to feel like they are the only person in the world. So every time a thought comes up, you can watch the thoughts happening and you can refocus on what the person is saying. If you have a phone, you can turn it on silent and place it upside down so that you're not seeing notifications. And if you're in a formal counseling role, then you want to let people know how many times they can meet with you. So, for example, I've worked at organizations where they can meet with me 1,000,000 times if they want. I've worked for places where they can only meet with me 8 times because there's a wait list and we can't see the same people forever. So if there's a limit, it's important for them to know that. You want to collaboratively set goals in the first session, and also it's really important to foreshadow the ending when they're starting to run out of sessions, because you don't want the person on their last opportunity to see you, maybe they don't realize they've lost track, and then all of a sudden they learn that day that they're never going to see you again. So if the person had like 8 sessions, then at session 4, I might say, we're halfway through our work together. How are you feeling? And then remind them on sessions 6 and 7, by the way, we're going to get to number 8 soon. So this can be a helpful acronym to remember. It's called SOLAR. So we sit squarely facing the speaker. We have an openness to our posture. And with this openness, in some places in the world, like North America, there's an assumption that if you have your arms crossed, if you've crossed your legs, that you're closed, that you don't want to listen to the other person, or that you have walls up. That may not necessarily be true, that those types of assumptions are often people's own projections, but because the assumption exists, we need to have an open posture so that other people will feel listened to. We can lean in towards the speaker to show that we're engaged. Eye contact is important. I recognize that this is not easy for everyone, especially when we consider neurodiversity. And we want to relax while we're listening, so we don't want to be sort of on the edge of our seat, ready to jump out of the chair. And some things to avoid are we don't want to make loud, sudden noises that can startle people. If you're in a building with people, you don't want to be sneaking up on them, even accidentally. A lot of people with trauma experience hypervigilance and a heightened startle response and are easily startled. So we don't want to engage their nervous systems in that way. So when I was working at group homes, I would try to make my presence known when I was entering a room, just so that people wouldn't be startled. And it's important not to wear keys around your neck. So a lot of people will wear lanyards with keys. I worked at an HIV organization that had a safe consumption site, and we learned that type of thing reminds a lot of people of jail, and I would say of group homes too, because workers in jail would sometimes wear their keys like that. And it can come off it can create a barrier if you're wearing like extremely fancy clothes that show off your wealth if you have a high income. So what we're doing in counseling is we're asking questions. The vast majority of things that you would be saying in a counseling setting would be in the form of a question. And we want to ask open-ended questions. So an open-ended question is a question that can be answered by more than just a yes/no. A closed-ended question might be a yes/no answer. Open-ended questions get people talking more. So, for example, what's been going on this week is an open-ended question. You're going to get more information than if you ask, did you have a good week? If you ask, did you have a good week? They're just going to say yes. If you ask people, how are you feeling? Even though that is a open-ended question technically, if you ask people, how are you feeling? They've been conditioned to just say, I'm good, I'm fine. So in counseling, we can ask, what are you feeling as we talk about this? And then they might name an emotion. It's very important to avoid advice giving. If you want to give advice, you can ask first, can I make a suggestion? We don't want to tell people what to do or what not to do. They often know what they need, and they just need to have someone to reflect with them and to ask the right questions to help them arrive at those conclusions. So we're constantly asking questions like the Socratic method of teaching. People don't need you to fix their feelings. This is something that we talk a lot about in couples therapy. They usually just want to be listened to. And you can ask, are you looking to be listened to or are you looking for solutions? You can universalize things so that they don't feel alone by saying something like, I bet a lot of people in your situation feel that way. And you don't always have to know what to say or what to do. When we think about co-regulation occurs when your own nervous system regulates the nervous system of somebody else and vice versa. So this happens when people feel listened to, and it doesn't have to be in person, it can happen over Zoom. The sound of a calming voice engages co-regulation. So just you being there literally is helping immensely. So now what I'd like to do is I'm going to use two different koans that are counseling based. I'm going to ring the bell, and since this is recorded, when there will be a moment where we talk, and I'll let you know when that's about to happen. And since it's recorded, maybe we'll just do that in the chat so that people don't show up in the recording. But for now, you can just meditate on the koan. So what we're going to do is I want you to just begin by taking a comfortable meditative posture. And we'll begin the koan practice by listening to the sound of the bell. And what I'd like you to do is to listen more deeply than you have ever listened to anything in your entire life. Each time the bell is struck, follow the sound of the bell into absolute silence. And then while you're listening, at some point, I will say the koan, and then you can reflect on it and experience it. first koan. Is it possible to just purely listen without an opinion? Is it possible to just purely listen without an opinion? You've listened as deeply as you can to the ringing sound of this bell. Reflect and connect to this depth of listening. Is it possible to listen with no agenda, no opinion? Is there a depth of just pure listening? Is your mind deeper than the thought, listen? Is there a deeper listening than the sense of I am listening? Is this mind deeper and more spacious than what arises within it? Is this mind deeper than the sensations, thoughts, and emotional feelings that are expressed within it? So that's the first koan. So we'll have a moment if you would like to type into the chat what came up for folks. Thanks. Someone said, yes, I can. Okay. So with this, we're identifying and claiming an awareness that transcends whatever is arising within this awareness, this clear, deep mind. This unopinionated listening is pure awareness, also called jhana or zen, and we want to understand the difference between conceptual listening and meditative listening. So that's the first koan, and it's also important to note that opinions are important. We're not saying that opinions are bad or anything like that. I teach socially engaged Buddhism, and we don't want to say that there's anything wrong with opinions. We're just talking about a particular type of listening. Oh, and then we have some more comments in the chat. Someone said, for me, it seemed that listening to the bell and its vibrations means to me to identify the sound with something else. Thanks. In another comment, the words presence and resonance appeared. Thank you. All right, so we'll move to the second koan. So again, getting comfortable and listening to the sound of the bell. The second koan. Where within your body is the center of this deeper listening located? Where within your body is the center of this deeper listening located? Slow way down. Listen deeply. Scan your physical body. Where is the center, the locus of this deepest awareness within you? Okay, so we'll have a moment if folks would like to share where they found that deeper listening in the chat. Okay, someone wrote everywhere and nowhere. And someone else wrote chest or belly. Another person in the belly. Another person forehead, belly, foot soles, hand palms at the same time. Thanks, everyone. So what we're trying to get at here is the difference between surface or ego listening, also known as head listening, or overstanding, and deep embodied heart listening, or understanding. So sometimes people might feel the listening in their head, and this might be a sign that there is a intellectualizing of what's going on, an overstanding. So we want to get to feeling it in our heart, having embodied heart listening, which is true understanding. And if you don't literally feel it in your heart, some people do, that's okay too. But ultimately, we just want to be able to note the difference between head listening, overstanding, and heart listening or understanding. So this allows us to move from, we talked about clear, deep mind a minute ago. Now we're tapping into clear, deep heart mind. And some people, when they're working on this koan over time, they might breathe in the words listen and heart through their chest to embody that heart listening as a signal to our being to listen with our hearts rather than intellectualizing whatever we're hearing. And we know that Kuan Yin, who is also known as a non-binary bodhisattva, I write about this in my book, Queer Engaged Buddhism, which we will talk about later on today at the book launch in a couple of hours. Kuan Yin, a big part of their awakening was through listening. Their name literally means regarder of the cries of the world. And we're listening for the meaning of what a person is saying, so we're not focusing on semantics or picking apart the words. If their body language and tone don't match what they're saying, there might be an emotion underneath that they haven't been allowed to express. So if the person grew up in a culture where crossing their arms means they're angry and they're saying, I'm fine, they might not be fine. And also we want to be aware of our projections, because I know for myself, often when I cross my arms, I'm cold and I find that this keeps me warm. So we have to directly ask. We can't just assume that we know what people are feeling. Because some of what we think of is empathy is often projection. Because we think about how we feel when we're saying X, Y, and Z, sounding in a particular tone or doing particular body language. We can use something called the empathic echo. So when you're counseling, it's very important to paraphrase what the person says. When there are pauses, paraphrasing or repeating back to the person what they just said helps them feel heard, and we can check to make sure that we heard things correctly. The empathic echo is a paraphrase where we mirror not just what they've said, but we also note the emotions in our paraphrasing. So for example, a client says, my parents constantly berate me. I wish they would fall off the face of the earth. And the counselor says, it sounds like there's some anger coming up for you about their treatment of you. The client says, I hate them, I'm done with them. And the counselor repeats in the paraphrasing, you're done with them. So here's the paraphrase, and here's that empathic echo. So we have a soft voice while we're counseling, and we maintain something called unconditional positive regard. This means always seeing the good in the client. Very similar to always seeing the person's Buddha nature, their basic goodness. It doesn't mean that we agree with everything that they've done or are doing or saying. It means that we always see the good in them. We always see their true awakened nature. And in counseling, we maintain the skill of silence. So during periods where the person stops talking, we don't just jump in to say something to fill the void. The soup is cooking, the person is thinking, so we allow silence to be there. They're digesting what was just talked about. Some people feel really awkward during silence, and we can use our meditation practice to have less aversion to it. In terms of counseling, there's a lot of talk about self-disclosure. So self-disclosure is when we share our own personal experiences. And in formal counseling, we do this very rarely. We don't want to make it about us. It's about the other person. So we only share when it would benefit the person, and we don't go into great detail. So we might say me too, or as survivors we, which indicates that we too are a survivor. Those are sufficient. So we barely talk about ourselves in formal counseling settings. In certain forms of counseling, you never talk about yourself ever. There's a form of counseling called feminist therapy where you actually do share a little bit, because that can lower the power dynamic. And the power dynamic will always be there, but we can lower it a bit by skillfully using limited self-disclosure. But they should be doing the vast majority of the talking. In terms of hugs, you can ask yourself, am I wanting to hug them for them, or is the hug for me? So generally we would avoid hugging clients. We could hug friends if we're really close. And we also might note a hug can sometimes be a way of stifling or muting the person's crying because we're uncomfortable with it, rather than letting it be expressed. So, for example, with babies, when we hold a baby, sometimes we hold its head into our chest, hoping that the crying will stop and kind of muting the crying. So with babies, sometimes we recommend that people put the baby on their lap and the baby faces outwards so that the cry can be let out. So instead of hugs, I mean, you can ask the person if they want a hug. We always ask first. But it might be more beneficial if you're very close, not with a client, but if you're with a close friend, to touch their arm. Touch can be very soothing and can engage the nervous system, but we don't want to stifle the person's crying. But again, if it's a client or something, then I wouldn't engage in touch at all. Or I wouldn't recommend doing so. Sometimes therapists will hug, but in general, it's usually better not to. A lot of people have had power used over them, and we don't want to replicate that dynamic. If you have something they can fidget with, that can be helpful for some people. And we can use the skill of joining, which involves the therapist's ability to see the world through the client's eyes. So we're momentarily adapting their frame of reference. It's like as if everybody has an island and we're going to their island. And when you are on that person's island, everything that they say makes sense according to them. It doesn't mean that we agree with it, but it makes sense because we're seeing through their perspective. That's the core of validation. So we're mirroring the person's body language, making facial expressions that show that we hear the affect, the emotionality of what they're saying. And we also use the skill of reframing. So we're not quite invalidating, but we do help people re-story an unhelpful narrative. Often people's narratives, we live storied lives, and often people's narratives about themselves are influenced by the world and are influenced by oppression, marginalization, and trauma. So for example, a client says, I left my last job because of my abusive boss. I'm a bad person for leaving my coworkers there all alone to deal with him. I feel guilty. And then the counselor can say, I'm hearing that some guilt is coming up for you. So that's the empathic echo and the paraphrasing. And then the client says, I just feel like a horrible person for abandoning my coworkers who also have to deal with that toxic boss. The counselor might say, I wonder if there might be a way to reframe this, another way of thinking about the situation that could be a more helpful story to tell yourself. You did what you had to do for your own self-care, and that may set an example for your old coworkers to also leave that toxic job too. So instead of being a bad person, you might be a role model for them. So before reframing, I would also validate the person and explain it makes sense that you would feel this way, and then add the reframe so that we can look at it from a different point of view. In terms of emotions, often people will use the word but in order to negate the previous part of a sentence. So we can encourage folks to replace it with and we can do that ourselves as well. So for example, I can't tell you how many times I have heard this 1,000 times, and this reflects part of the manipulation that occurs in abusive and violent relationships. People will say, my ex was violent with me, but he had a bad childhood. So the but kind of negates the previous part of the sentence. And we want there to be room for both. So we can explain, sometimes we use the word but, and it's possible to have both. Your ex was violent and he had a bad childhood. And that doesn't mean that you should have to bear the brunt of this learned behavior. We can also replace I am an emotion. People will say I am angry, I am sad, I am anxious with this emotion is present or this emotion is coming up for me. There's anger is present, sadness is here. I'm feeling anxious. Fear is coming up for me. This disidentifies us from the feeling and helps it not control us. We can encourage self-compassion. It's also important to never say, I understand, because people will say you don't. And we want to let people know that often we're experiencing more than one emotion at a time. And it can take people some time to train themselves to be able to get a sense of what those emotions are. In terms of body language, sometimes people will laugh during conversations about their own trauma, or they'll laugh at funerals, and then they may feel guilty or confused about why they're laughing. What we've realized through grief counseling is that people use the same muscles to laugh that they do to cry. In counseling, we want to be aware of our own projections. I talked a bit about this earlier. So projection is a defense mechanism where the ego defends itself against unconscious impulses or qualities, both positive and negative, by denying their existence in themselves and attributing them to others. So we project our beliefs onto others, though we're often unaware that we're doing it. So we may accuse another person of being angry when really we are angry. We also put people on pedestals and idolize people when we ourselves have the good qualities that we see in those people. We just don't recognize them in ourselves. So projection is from client to counselor, and counter projection is from counselor to client. So I'm not going to go through all of these examples because I want to get to the suicide prevention section as well. I'll pick one of these. So sometimes people will have a bad day at work, and then they'll come home and they'll look at their partner and be like, "Are you angry with me?" And no, the partner isn't angry at all. The other person is angry and and can't own it. It's also important to be aware of transference. So transference is a redirection of a client's feelings for a significant person towards the counselor. It can be an erotic transference, and it can be seen in many other forms like rage towards the counselor, hatred, mistrust, parentification, extreme dependence, or placing the counselor, and you might see this in Buddhist communities, placing people in a godlike or guru status. Countertransference is a redirection of the counselor's feelings towards the client. So it's very important to be attuned to our countertransference and regulate our emotions. It also gives us valuable insight into what types of dynamics clients might be trying to elicit in us. So for example, some people will walk into a room and see somebody and automatically be like, "I don't like that person. I just have a bad feeling." And they think that maybe they're detecting some type of vibe, but it may not be a vibe. That person might just remind that person of somebody that has harmed them. So for example, if a person has had a poor relationship with their mother, and they walk into a room and they see somebody who looks exactly like their mother, they may automatically dislike the person. And that's an example of transference. In terms of triggers, if you are triggered, and a trigger is often a memory of trauma that is so intense that we feel like we're back there again. And if we're triggered, it can be valuable to try not to leave the person that we're with immediately. If we have to remove ourselves from the situation, we want to see if we can help find somebody else who can support the person first. And triggers don't always mean that you can't support the person. Sometimes they do. There are ways to manage these. Again, counseling is a meditation. We can practice trigger bracketing, which means in our mind we breathe, ground ourselves, give ourselves compassion, and then gently make a promise to ourselves that we will deal with this trigger later, and we'll refocus on the person for now. To enhance our communication, we can share our observations with people when we're dealing with challenges like crisis counseling. If there's an incident that needs to be dealt with, it can be important to directly speak to what we observe. So for instance, if we need to de-escalate someone in the context of violence, we can share our feelings. And again, our feelings are related to direct observation. So our feelings are emotions or sensations. Feelings are not thoughts. So, for example, people will say, I feel like you don't do the dishes. That's not a feeling. That's an observation or a thought. I feel is an emotion. We can share our needs. And we can share direct requests. Requests are not demands, so that means that people can say no to them. So this can be valuable if we're in crisis situations, or even just in our communities, if we're dealing with challenging relationships in temples, at monasteries, or in our own lives. I also find this dialogue practice really valuable. It was invented for couples therapy, and we don't need to use it just in couples therapy. It actually describes how to be a good listener and how to be a good counselor. So this can be seen as a foundation of supporting people. So in couples therapy, people take turns doing this. And I think really I just want us to look at the concepts outside of a couples type of situation and what we can learn from this. So the first step is mirroring, which we talked about. So in this, the person talks and we just repeat back what they've said. And then we say, am I getting it? Is there more? Then validation. A validating sentence isn't just that's valid. If we just say that's valid, we need a little more than that. So a validating sentence can begin with, it makes sense that you would feel that way because blank. So it makes sense that you would feel angry that I didn't do the dishes today because I also haven't done them in a month or something. So we think, why does it make sense? And again, we're going to that person's island. And then empathy. So we're asking and we're guessing what emotions the person might be feeling. So I imagine you might also be feeling sad because of X, Y, and Z. Am I getting it? Is there more? So at each of these steps, we say, am I getting it? Is there more? And again, going back to the idea that feelings are not thoughts, this is an emotion wheel. And there are a million of these. If you just go on Google Images, you can find any of them. And we can train ourselves to identify emotions on this wheel so that we can be better communicators. Some people might look at the wheel once a day for a while in order to get better acquainted with their emotions. We know from Buddhist practice that a lot of people have strong aversion to their emotions, or in psychology we would call it alexithymia, where people can't identify their emotions. And that's not a diagnosis, but rather a descriptive term. So by being more acquainted with our own emotions, we can better listen to and detect the emotions of others. So that's the counseling part. So now I'm going to bring up a different PowerPoint for suicide prevention. So when I did my PhD, my dissertation looked at how we can look at AIDS activism for suggestions on how we can prevent queer and trans suicides. And the reason I did that was because I found that much of our suicide prevention efforts, I used to work at a suicide hotline and at an AIDS organization, much of our suicide prevention efforts are focused on individual counseling, which is actually what I'm going to teach today, when in reality we also know that queer people are going to continue killing themselves until the conditions that make us want to die end. So ultimately, we need to end the structural conditions that are leading to people wanting to die, like homophobia, transphobia, interphobia, which needs to be talked about more in Buddhist communities, racism, ableism, and other forms of oppression. And today I'm just going to teach the individualized approach, which I actually kind of critique in my dissertation. If you want to learn more about that structural piece, there's a presentation about my dissertation defense that is on YouTube if you look me up. So we'll begin with some myths. All of these are false. So there's a myth that suicide is selfish. We know that people who are killing themselves often think that they are doing everybody a favor. So they think that they're being selfless. And telling someone it's selfish is not going to make them want to do it less. It's just going to shame them. There are myths that people just talk about it and they won't actually do it. This can come up a lot when somebody has been close to suicide many times unsuccessfully. Then people will have the person who cried wolf narrative in their head and be like, they're not going to do it. They're just looking for attention. Well, we know that people often do not successfully complete suicide the first time. It often takes multiple times to successfully complete it because it is physically hard to kill ourselves. So it's important to always take it seriously. There's the phrase attention seeking. It might be valuable to erase that phrase out of our vocabularies. That phrase is quite harsh, and if anything, we might change it to support seeking. But even then, some people are not really seeking support. Some people are, especially if they're directly talking to you about it, but sometimes they don't tell anybody. I would say the most important myth to be aware of is the myth that asking a person if they are considering suicide might cause them to start considering it if they haven't considered it already. The reason why this is the most important myth is because people are therefore afraid to ask. And if we don't ask, we don't know, and there's nothing we can do to help. So we always ask if we have even a hint of suspicion. If they're not already thinking about it, just asking, are you thinking about killing yourself, is not going to make someone decide to kill themselves. There is a myth that only people with mental health conditions think about suicide. It's very common for people who don't have mental health conditions but who are going through intense grief to think about suicide. And it's also very common for marginalized groups to think about suicide regardless of whether or not they have mental health conditions. There's a myth that the only thing we can do is give them a hotline number. A myth that people who take their life just do it randomly out of the blue. Often people have been planning this for a long time. And there's a myth that somebody who seems to have their act together, who seems to have a good life, isn't at a risk of suicide. There's a lot that we don't know about people. So when we're doing suicide counseling, we use the word died by suicide, or the phrase, we don't say committed suicide. In Canada, suicide is no longer a crime. It is in some countries, but regardless of where you are, even if you're somewhere where it is a crime, we're not approaching suicide prevention with a lens of criminality. So we say the person died by suicide. We also know that in Canada, suicide is the leading cause of death of gay men in Canada, even though under what in gender studies we call homonationalism, people think that Canada is gay paradise. And we know that in Ontario, where I am, in a recent year where trans people were surveyed, 40% of trans youth thought about suicide in the prior year. So this is a really important topic for our community. Often, the person wants the feeling to end rather than their own life. And we know from Buddhism that everything is impermanent. And Buddhist concepts like impermanence are to be understood, are to be experienced rather than understood intellectually. So we might think we know that things are impermanent, but we don't really know it inside. So it can be an important reminder. And we can remind ourselves that if the person is talking to us about it, there is a very small part of them that wants to live. And we can ask them to tap into that part, and we can remind them of that. Often people have been planning it for a very long time. And if somebody knows someone who's killed themselves, they're much more likely to do it themselves. Children of parents who've died by suicide are much more likely to also kill themselves. And Indigenous men in Canada have the highest suicide rate of any population. So we need to consider how different oppressions intersect and interlock. So for one oppression to end, they all must end. 75% of completed suicides are men. And this is because men often use more lethal and violent methods like guns, whereas women often use pills, which have a low mortality rate. And you'll remember a minute ago I said 40% of trans youth in Ontario thought about suicide in the year surveyed. The number one determining factor of suicidality in that study was family acceptance, or lack thereof. So again, we need a structural approach to suicide that advocates for the end of oppression, a socially engaged approach, not just crisis counseling. And today I'm teaching crisis counseling. So don't panic. If you are internally panicking, then don't show it. We do want to be a bit authentic, so we can say, I'm worried about you. And we can't make it about us, because then the person will feel like they need to take care of us, and they might regret telling us. So what we're doing is assessing the situation and determining whether or not it could be valuable to involve a third party. And we're going to talk about the problematics of involving a third party in a minute, because that can also cause a lot of harm. So we'll use the foundational skills we talked about earlier. We always take it seriously. And having thoughts about suicide is very different than actively planning to kill themselves. And this is what we're trying to assess of which one it is. So you can let the person know that you hear their pain and you know how much they want to feel better. You'll be there with them every step of the way. Help is available, and we can continually remind them, even if this feeling it feels like it's been going on for years, it won't be like this forever. Things are impermanent. We're not going to get with the person, we don't want to get too philosophical, so we're not going to start saying, there's no self and everything is empty and all of that. Maybe if they're a student and we have, a relationship with them as a Buddhist teacher for many years, but in general, we're talking on the relative level for the most part. So we can help ground the person. They might not want to eat, and that's okay if they don't. If they're willing to eat, then food can be really grounding. It can be helpful to give them a glass of water or warm tea. If you have a blanket, you can give that to them, or they can hug a couch pillow while they talk to you. Make sure they're warm and comfortable. Animals with a calm demeanor can help, as long as the animal isn't mauling them. So if you have a really chill animal, then animals can cause co-regulation. And the reason why I say a chill animal is we don't want to be working with somebody who's talking about being sexually abused and then an animal jumps onto their lap into their crotch, for example. So we want to be careful that people are not startled, because like I mentioned earlier, people who've experienced trauma often have a strong startle response. So for the steps for suicide assessment, We always ask directly, have you been thinking about killing yourself? Again, some people are scared that that asking will cause somebody to think about it, but it will not. And some people are scared to ask because they don't want to know the answer. The next question is, do you have a plan as to how you would do it? This is really important. If there's no plan, then it's passive suicidal thoughts, and we definitely probably don't need to involve a third party. We just need to listen and be there for the person. If they have a plan, do they have the means to carry it out? So if their plan is to overdose, do they have pills? Do they have a date and time in mind? Have they made arrangements for their death recently, like clearing their schedule for the day that they plan to die, arranging childcare, writing a will, writing suicide letters? If yes to all of these questions, it might be time to consider involving a third party. And again, we need to also consider how involving a third party can cause harm, which we'll talk about in a minute. And the third party could be, so traditionally, it's often a hospital. It doesn't always have to be. It could also be a partner, a roommate, a friend, or if a parent is accepting of their identity, a parent. And there might be ways to navigate this too. So there are alternatives. So are they willing to do things that can prevent that plan from happening? So would they give you the pills that they were planning to use? Would they throw out the rope that they were planning to use? Or would they be willing to sleep at a friend's house that night? It's very important to make sure the person isn't alone at night if possible. We can make a safety plan with the person. So a safety plan might look at how do I know that I'm in crisis? Who are the people that I can talk to? What are the things that I can do that are regulating? And we can ask them to promise that that if they are about to do it, that they'll call us or someone else first. So now I'd like to talk about wellness checks, the problematics of police and hospitals. So we have suicide hotlines around the world. I worked at one, and in Canada, all helplines except Trans Lifeline will call 911. They're not going to call 911 on everybody, but if you answer yes to all of these questions, they will probably call 911. Trans Lifeline will not unless you directly ask them as the caller to call 911 for you. Crisis lines, some of them anyways, have the ability to get police to trace the call. So some crisis lines, while they're on the phone with somebody, they can press a code into the phone, and that will send the caller's number to the police, and then they use another phone to contact the police and be like, I traced this call, can you trace their location and go to them? So they can find the person's location, or they can ask the police to, rather. So if you're calling a helpline, it can be valuable to make people aware of that. And if you're dealing with a suicidal person, you can call with the person rather than without the person. Police violence can lead to the death of the suicidal person, and so can suicide. Police are notorious for murdering racialized people, trans people, and people in mental health crises. Child protection social workers might take a suicidal person's children, causing extreme trauma to children and parent. So if a person goes to a hospital and they're suicidal, they will likely speak to a hospital social worker. And if the person has children, the hospital social worker may contact child protection social workers who might take their children for fear that they cannot take care of them. This often does more harm than good. So it's important for people to be aware of that so that they can make an informed decision on whether or not they're going to disclose at the hospital that they have children. And they can also demonstrate their care for their child by making arrangements for a babysitter. So we want to explore all avenues first before contacting 911. There are also, in some cities, mobile crisis services where a social worker might come and they may or may not have police, depending on the organization. There may not be any right answer here, so I'm not going to tell you if they answer every single question on here, yes, call 911, and I'm not going to tell you never call 911 because it's complicated, and you also may need to check if you have a professional license or if there are laws in your country. And I'm going to just present the consequences of different options so that people can make their own decisions. If you feel your only option is to call 911, then it's important to ask the operator for what's called a silent call, which means that when first responders get to the person, they're not ringing their sirens for everybody in the neighborhood to hear, and then all their neighbors are asking questions and everybody knows. You can ask for what's called a wellness check if you worry that the person might have done something or be at risk of doing something. And in this case, police would come and they may or may not take them to the hospital. You can also just encourage the person to voluntarily go to the hospital. When taken to the hospital, they may be held involuntarily and forced to be there for a certain amount of hours, days, or weeks while they undergo psychiatric assessments. Going to a hospital can fast track being able to see a psychiatrist or obtain outpatient referrals. And we also need to be aware that there is psychiatric violence and psychiatric incarceration that happens at hospitals that can do a great deal of harm. And there's often a lot of abuse, be it emotional, physical, and sexual at hospitals, and particularly in psychiatric units. So another alternative is we can get them to make an appointment with their doctor. So for suicide support, it's important to be aware of warning signs like giving away possessions, giving away money, talking about how they won't always be around, reckless behavior, saying goodbyes in a weird way because they're not planning to, as far as you know, go anywhere. Maybe quitting their job or quitting school. So we want to listen to the person's story of what's happened to them and encourage them to think about what their supports are and how they can connect with those supports maybe within the next 24 hours. We can use a strengths-based approach, so we can encourage the person to reflect on their strengths and how they can use those strengths to navigate their difficulties. And we're not only asking questions about why they want to die, we are asking those questions, and we're also making sure to mention that if they're talking to us, part of them might want to live. So we can ask them to get in touch with that part and to consider what makes them want to live. Some people can't think of anything, so we can ask them what's helped in the past, what's made them want to live before. It's very important not to guilt trip people. We can briefly mention that we would be very sad if they died, and so would a lot of other people. We don't want to belabor that point. We're not trying to add more difficult feelings of guilt on top of what they're already feeling. They usually think that they're doing everybody else a favor. And they usually think that they're a burden. So suicidal thoughts mean that something has to change in a person's life or they will die. What is it that needs to change? And how can we break a change plan down into baby steps? We can also have them think about how their plan to kill themselves could fail. In Gestalt therapy, which is a therapy that was largely inspired by Zen Buddhism, there's something called retroflection. Retroflection is a psychological defense mechanism, kind of like in the category like how projection is, Retroflection is when we turn our emotions against ourselves. So in Gestalt therapy, often suicide is seen as an extreme form of retroflection. We might be angry at someone, and because we're not allowed to express that anger outwards, we express it towards ourselves. If we're abused, we may wish that we could kill that person, but we can't because that's illegal, so we might kill ourselves. We can think about this in the context of homophobic bullying. We often responsibilize ourselves for abuse. There is something called the just world phenomena. The just world phenomena, it's a cognitive bias where we are taught that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. Our parents might directly teach us this. We get this teaching from the teaching of karma. And even if we are not directly taught this, we see it on TV. We're taught that bad people go to jail and good people are rewarded. And so when something bad happens to us, like sexual abuse, like homophobic bullying, we might think, this bad thing happened to me, so I must be a bad person. So it may be beneficial to have the person identify what they might be angry at, if this anger is misdirected towards themselves. And underneath anger is often sadness. Underneath sadness is often anger. And underneath both of those things is deep care. And it's important to follow up with the person and check in on them periodically afterwards to see how they're doing. Now I'm going to talk about what to do when somebody dies from suicide. I have had a lot of people die from suicide, most of them queer. None of them were clients, or actually one of them was a client. And it can be very difficult when somebody dies from suicide. And that person wasn't my client. That person was a client at an organization that I worked at. Most of these were people in the queer community that I had known personally. And it is very important to remind ourselves and anyone else who knew the person over and over and over again that if this person was determined to die, there was nothing we could have said or done to prevent it. We can do everything we can to support a person, and ultimately, unless the person is strapped down by us, we cannot totally prevent everything. And even then, there may be ways that people can kill themselves when they're strapped down. So we cannot be responsible for the actions of other people. Nearly everyone who is left behind in suicide feels an ocean of guilt. It almost always turns into something called complicated grief, which is a term used to describe prolonged, extremely difficult bouts of grief that are very intense. So it's important to surround yourself with others. It's very important to do a type of mourning ritual. You can go to their funeral if you can. Often, some people think that we shouldn't take children to funerals because it's too intense. It's actually very important that we take children to funerals because it can help mark the passing and it helps with the grieving process. If we can't go to the funeral, we can hold our own privately. I know for me as a queer person, I don't feel welcome at funerals from my family of origin. It would cause drama if I was there. So I have my own funerals for people who are related to me when they die. We can also plant a tree in the person's honor, just something to mark the passing. Do not numb feelings with drugs, weed, or alcohol. This will make those feelings worse. This is a form of the poisonous mind state of aversion. Often people may feel so guilty that they fantasize about joining the person by also killing themselves. This is very normal. We can normalize these thoughts, and we can get at the painful feelings and give ourselves self-compassion. So when one of my ex-boyfriends killed himself, a friend of mine who was also a therapist and a colleague said, just like nurses and medical doctors, we are providing emotional life support to the people around us. And sometimes life support stops working. People cannot be on life support forever. We are making their lives better while we're in it. There are also support groups for people who've lost someone to suicide. There are support groups in person and online that you can look at. It can be valuable to be around other people who have experienced a similar type of loss. So now I'd like to talk about further training. There's a course that you can take called ASSIST, or Applied Suicide Intervention Skills Training. It's a 2-day course. It's required for most jobs in mental health. It will go through the suicide assessment steps that we talked about earlier. It may not have the critical lens that we discussed regarding looking at the challenges of things like racism with police and all of that. And at the same time, it does help increase confidence for dealing with these types of conversations. There are other certificates that can be valuable. Mental health first aid might be a good one. Nonviolent crisis intervention can be a good one. There are counseling courses online, workbooks, and you have to do your own inner work to be an effective counselor. So the best therapists are in therapy themselves for a very long time. If you want to provide spiritual care, it's very important to know the referral sources in your area. If you don't know them, you can look them up, and you can collaboratively Google them with the person. You can also take a look at my book, Queer Engaged Buddhism. I'll talk about that at the book launch, which is happening, I think, in an hour and a half-ish. It's happening later today. My book is around queerness and Buddhism. It also has meditations at the end of a lot of the chapters that can help with our understanding of our own emotions. It has meditations on compassion, it has koans, and it has a chapter on Buddhist psychotherapy and spiritual care for queer and trans communities. Okay, so that is all I wanted to talk about today. So thank you all so much for being here and for listening to this talk. It's a really important skill to learn, and I hope that you've gained something from this. So I really appreciate everyone's time. Namo Shakyamuni Buddha.